Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Art of Prevention podcast. And today I'm sitting down with Tyler Kemp, who is a chiropractor outside of Cincinnati, Ohio. And today we're really going to dive into the topic of bone stress injuries. And we're going to talk about what bone stress injuries are, some of the groups and individuals that are likely to get bone stress injuries, and then, of course, how do we prevent these bone stress injuries from happening? And really, how do we prevent the recurrence of bone stress injuries? Because that is a hugely important topic and something that really occurs very frequently. And we'll actually dive into a case study, which is myself from back in the day when I got a bone stress injury and then I had a recurrent bone stress injury. So, Tyler, tell us a little bit more about yourself. I know we went to school at Logan around the same time, and you were one of the thought leaders or like kind of club presidents in one of the clubs too. So, give us a little bit of a rundown. I know you used to run as well, right?
Yeah, I did. First off, thanks for having me on, Nick. So my background, I'm from outside of Philadelphia. I had the similar chiropractic experience of most of, had an injury. For me, it was a meniscus tear in high school. I did track and cross country. I went to a PT initially, didn't really help, and then ironically, we went to a sports chiropractor just on a whim and took a very active approach of like, hey, you don't need surgery, like we can manage this and get you back. And I just thought that was really neat. So that inspired and interested me to pursue that personally. I did go to Logan in St. Louis, Missouri. I'm currently in an office in a little north of Cincinnati, but I also had a previous experience at a similar office that was very, very sports medicine based. Got to do some few preceptorships there, so that kind of drew my interest with this topic.
Yeah, and you've done some presentations for a couple of organizations about this topic specifically, right?
Yeah. It's something that I've seen a lot in clinic, and I wanted to understand it more. So we'll kind of touch on this later, but the office I was at initially during COVID, there was a month. It just seemed like we had like 14 to 16 bone stress injuries. Our office had a really good relationship with most of the high school teams, and it just felt like we were, diagnosing one or sending an MRI out every single day, and it just got to a point of, what are we just attracting this? Is there something we're missing? How do we get better with one catching these, and then two, how do we get better with managing them? So it was born out of this. If I'm going to see a lot of these, or say I, quote unquote, am a sports chiropractor or treat athletes, like I want to actually be able to do it and do it well.
And I mean, a lot of people won't be familiar with the nomenclature of bone stress injury. So for me, when I was in, running, in high school and college, the biggest thing that people feared was a stressy, a stress fracture, right? And
Yeah.
bone stress injury is kind of this umbrella term that encompasses basically this broad range of bone injury, correct?
Yeah, so I want you to think of a BSI or bone stress injury as an overuse condition for an imbalance of repair and remodeling. So it's basically you're spending the credit card that your bone can't cash. You are burning through too much load and all that stuff, and your body just doesn't have enough time to recover. So it operates on this little spectrum. So on the lower end, you have the stress reaction. In the middle, you have the stress fracture, and then the far end, which hopefully we don't really ever get there, is actually a complete fracture. So the stress reaction is the train starting to leave the station. You're starting to have decrease in the quality of your bone. You might even have a thing called a periosteal reaction, which is where that little connective tissue layer around the bone actually gets pissed off. That's the inflammation. That's where it gets kind of sore or tender. The stress fracture is actually where you have some kind of break in cortex. There's actually a crack in the bone. I want you to think of it starting to crack into it like a piece of chalk, not like a twig that got snapped in half kind of thing. And obviously, complete fracture is just something we don't want to avoid entirely. So that's kind of the framework we want to operate in.
Yeah, and later on, we'll talk about grading and high risk versus low risk
Yep.
fractures, etc. And
Yeah.
one thing that I'm also going to do is I'm going to do a solo episode on this topic where I can really talk about some of the anatomy and physiology of bone and some of the pathophysiology surrounding bone health or bone injury. So we'll be able to focus more on some of the higher level things today. We'll touch on some of the pathophysiology and stuff like that. But if you're listening to this and you're having, trouble keeping up with some of the physiology terms and things like that, then you can go over to that solo episode and you can give that a listen as well.
Now, I know you dealt with at least one, if not two, bone injuries, right?
Yes. So my freshman year of high school, we had a really good cross country season. We had separate divisions for freshman, junior varsity, and varsity. And I was one of the, runners on our freshman team. And I remember getting second place at district to one of my other teammates, which was really cool. So we won the freshman division. And then a couple of weeks later, just starting to get some pain at the top of my tibia and trying to like run through it for a little bit, being really afraid to tell my coach about it. And then having that just progress to pain with walking, pain at rest. And then, we couldn't really figure out what it was. And then weeks later, we got an x-ray of my tibia and we saw actually some of that bone remodeling starting to occur and some of that calcium deposition where I had a stress fracture that was healing.
Hmm. And then you ended up getting a second one shortly after, right?
Yeah, so I managed to get better. So we, rested for way too long. I was just murdering myself in the training room on the bike, which we can talk about some of the things that we should or shouldn't do regarding that. And then I got into track season and I was having a pretty good track season. I actually went sub 5 minutes in the mile, which I was really proud of at that
Nice.
time. Um, and then like 2 weeks later, I started having that same like achy pain in my tibia
Yeah,
on the
you were
opposite
a
leg.
you're a frequent flyer. Yeah. So the I'll kind of compare to some things I've seen, and then we'll kind of use you as an example. So the one thing we noticed with COVID just created a ton of issues in everything, but especially like in sports, because you're having a lot of kids, especially we'll use runners as our primary example. Most of the injuries, most stress fractures, BSIs occur in the lower extremity, and most commonly in runner. It does occur in other sports, hockey, things like that, but we'll use runners are the majority, so we'll use that as the stereotype. But for you, the thing we saw pretty frequently was the rhythm kind of got lost. Where you have a kid that does cross country in the fall, maybe they do winter track or basketball, and then they do track in the spring. They have some steady amount of load throughout their year, and then with the pandemic, you have February, March, basically everything being shut down. And then depending on where you're at in the country, in the fall, sports kind of came back in some modified way. For at least locally, a lot of coaches, what they ended up doing was they had they were trying to manage everything online of just emailing kids their, hey, do X amount of mileage per week, things like that. Well, a lot of kids might not have actually been doing it of, sure, coach, I'm hitting 40 miles a week when they're really doing 15 to 20. So then when things got back in an organized way, coach says, hey, we're going to bump it up to 50 a week. We're going to really push it. 40 to 50 is, one jump, but, 15 to 50 is a significantly bigger jump. So you're having all these kids going through a huge change in load. And then it was just this ugly buildup. The other thing is, and you kind of experienced it yourself, is there's a huge lag time between when there's the change in load and then when we're actually going to experience symptoms. So like generally it's 3 to 4 weeks. It peaks out at 5 to 8 weeks. So we see this, there's a lot of data the military does because people join basic training and then a couple weeks into a month in, they're starting to have these injuries just because some people might not be well trained and then they go into basic training, which is moderately intense. And that's why you have this, it seems like the most common month, at least this is just observational data, like September-ish, October-ish is when people really notice it, because you might start training a little harder end of July, early August. Couple weeks in, you're going to notice it a little after Labor Day weekend. And then you're kind of pinched because late September, early October, it's okay, I'm dealing with this injury. Do I just kind of suck it up till states or whatever instead of trying to rest it and things like that? And this is a common injury, and there's a lot of issues with it. There was one bit of data where it was out of 2014 where they did like a epidemiology of all stress fractures in high school athletes, And 65% of them that had a stress fracture either resulted in medical disqualification, end of their season, like they were just done, or they had 3 weeks or more of time lost. So the obviously prevention's one goal, but the sooner we catch it, the sooner you have a shot at potentially getting this kid back.
Yeah, and for me, obviously we didn't do a great job of, or I didn't do a great job of catching the first one, right? I was afraid to tell my coach, so I was just like training until I couldn't train anymore. And then it like really kind of like set off. And then in the interim, I was really cross training really hard and keeping my engine really fit, which some people are saying it might actually be better to just decrease some of that overall load, right?
Your
And
overall volume.
and
Because
oh yeah, go ahead.
with with load management, it's always too much, too soon, too little. Like too much overall volume, too soon, whether it be ramping up that volume or the frequency, and then too little with recovery. So you didn't get a chance to really rest. So your body, from like a metabolic position, you were trying to repair that initial injury, and you just didn't have it in you to actually be able to fully recover, and that's why you developed the second one.
And I think that one thing that people don't always think about is that bone is a metabolically active tissue. So it's constantly changing and rearranging based on the stressors that we place upon it. And there's this kind of lag time between when we cause this micro damage, i.e., we put a bunch of strain on the bone with running high mileage and doing intense mileage, all the things that are natural and normally associated with training. And then these osteoclastic cells come in and they try and debride this micro damaged tissue. And once they do that, then these next set of cells called the osteoblasts can come in and they can relay down these hydroxyapatite crystals for building up and adapting to that stressor. But there's that lag in between, and some things that can really increase that gap include things like energy deficiency. And
Yep.
energy deficiency has two different components. One is your energy intake, and then the other one is your energy output, or what you're doing physically. So for me, I got that stress fracture, and then I didn't allow myself to heal as much because I was still like really doing a bunch of energy output in the training room on the bike, where it might have been better for me to just take a week or two of just complete rest, right?
Yeah, and the other, you made the comment, you're afraid to tell your coach, like that's a really common thing of, you don't want to. It's not this dramatic injury. It's not, you tore your hamstring and you're black and blue all over or something like that, or you tore your meniscus or you sprained your ankle and you're swollen, all that. Like it's just this really intense, initially some achy pain. So you're just thinking, okay, I'm gonna run through this, quote unquote. It's diffuse. It might hurt while you're running, might not. It might start to linger after. It's this very slow build, so it's kind of not easy, but it's easy to brush off. Of okay, maybe I just need to suck it up for a few weeks. Maybe I just need to ice it, whatever, things like that. And it's really easy to walk by. Like if you're an athlete and you're either hiding it or you don't want to be a quote unquote wuss, or if you have an old school coach who just kind of like suck it up, let her go.
Yeah. And I think the really nefarious thing is not really the first bone stress injury, but the fact that your rate of recurrence after a bone stress injury is so high.
Yeah.
You have a 6 or 7 times greater likelihood of sustaining a second bone stress injury after that first one. Can we talk a little bit about why that rate of re-injury is so high?
Yeah, I mean, some of it's, what are the factors the person carries with them? We know there's a higher prevalence if someone is a female athlete. So like that's not going to change. So, like that's already directed them on one thing. And then also just the things of their training style. If they're a high mileage runner and they didn't really recover well from the first one, it's going to just set them up for success or rather failure. And then other things like just the habits of like sleep and nutrition. Like if they weren't doing that the first time, they're just going to keep on burning the candle at both ends.
Yeah, and I mean the necessary deload too. I mean, especially
Yeah.
like you were talking earlier about, sometimes we have to completely unweight an athlete and have them literally go around on crutches for, a couple of different reasons, but to really get that deload stage so that the bone can heal itself. But when we deload one side, we can't forget we're also deloading the other side, and we're not giving that side the adequate stimulus necessary to adapt. So now when you return to running, you might have still like a really good, powerful aerobic engine, but now the entire chassis has become a little bit weakened.
I love to use the word chassis. It was fantastic. The So if we're going to talk about return, let's talk about like what are the subtypes, and then kind of how what our timelines will look like. So there's two broad buckets of bone stress injuries. There's high risk and there's low risk. So high risk means it has a doesn't have a great blood supply. It has a higher rate of progression, meaning the injury will go from a grade 1 to a grade 2 to a grade 3, and then finally a higher likelihood of needing surgery. So that's the type we want to avoid. These are all tagged by anatomy. So generally it's the anterior tibia, your shin bone, your femoral neck, your femur, the ball and socket joint, for lack of a better term, and then the sesamoid bone. And then lower risk is more metatarsal, your fibula, posterior medial tib. So you have these two regions, and then so the high risk versus low risk, and then there's the grading of how severe it is. So the way you get the grading is through imaging. So there used to be this thing of, and it's still really common now, of the grading scale will guide your treatment. So initially, everybody would used to get an X-ray. Generally, we won't see a cortical change until grade 3 or 4. So you might be a grade 1 or 2. You go to your PCP, go to chiropractor, whatever clinician. They take a picture. They say, "Hey, things are looking good. We can cross this off the list." It hasn't gotten bad enough to show up. So you've crossed something off the list that's still very apparent, and you're continuing to run. That's a huge problem. So from a parent, athlete, coach perspective, if you really want to rule this out or diagnose it, MRI is the gold standard. One, it's gonna tell you a ton more information, and then two, it's gonna give you what the grade is. The grade is really, really important. So Arnett et al. Has a nice framework. It compares low risk and high risk, and then low grade, high grade, and that gives you kind of a rough timeline for it. So, for example, like a low risk, high grade is about 9 weeks of recovery versus a high risk, high grade is more like 19 weeks. So it's this huge spectrum. So it's not perfect. Everybody's different, but now it starts to give you a little bit of a framework of how long something's going to take to actually get better. And then it also puts a limit on the parent, athlete, coach of how long is it going to take, because the intuitive desires to rush things. If someone sprains their ankle and it says, "Hey, it's going to be 6 to 8 weeks," they're going to say, "I'm going to try to do it in 5." They're going to try to push that limit. Instead, you're just saying, "Look, biology is going to drive the bus. This is how long it takes to heal, and if we don't let it heal right, this is going to become a frequent flyer issue," like Nick.
Yeah. And I think one thing, I was listening to a separate podcast on this topic, and you're right. We're always looking, how do we get back faster? What can I take, or what can I do to get back faster? And it's like, well, like you said, biology is driving the bus. This is a metabolically active tissue, but that doesn't mean that it's metabolically super quick tissue. We all understand, like, if you have a true fracture of a bone, you're going to be in a cast for 6 to 8 weeks, depending on the site of that bone and the extent of that injury. And with this stress fracture, it's that thing where you might be able to walk without pain. You might not even be able to see it on the X-ray. Actually, usually you don't see it on the X-ray, which we talked about. And say, if you don't see it on the X-ray, that means absolutely nothing. Like, you likely still have a low grade bone stress injury. It just hasn't healed yet. And oh, go ahead.
Good.
So one thing that they said on this podcast that I really like as a framework of thinking is, there's not much we can do to speed up this process, but there is a lot that we can do to slow it down.
Yes.
And those things include getting back to running or back to activities too quickly, having poor sleep, having poor nutrition, which oftentimes when you are injured, that's when, the ice cream comes out quite a bit, and, all these things, which is totally fine for a short period of time. But you need to make sure that you're resolving any energy deficits that you once had. So if you're someone who is a candidate or is at high risk for relative energy deficiency in sport, red S, then you really need to talk to your nutritionist or your sports counselor, et cetera, about getting more nutrition in so that then you can adequately supply your body with not only the calcium, but the energy that it needs in order to recover and heal that bone tissue.
100%. And we can, now that we're talking about the return, like let's kind of, we can talk about could have been done better with you, but I'll use an example of an athlete I saw a year ago. So this is in this is in like September-ish. He year-round runner, prefers track over cross country, doing cross country more to just kind of maintain his athletic level. Deep hip pain, just in the crease of his pants, can't single like weight bear, like just walking around the house doesn't feel good, like all these things. Saw him order the MRI in the first visit. He had a grade 3 edis femoral neck. So he's already the highest risk. So we immediately just had the conversation of more or less, hey, unfortunately, your season's over. With a grade 3, you're looking at about like 15 weeks for this thing to really heal. So like it was the conversation turned into, look, cross country's over. I'm so sorry. What can we do to set you up for success so that when you go to the track in the spring, you can actually do it, and then we can minimize the odds of you actually having recurrent. So for him, it was that 15 weeks, so that's about 4-ish months. So he was somebody we didn't really see like every week kind of thing because we're just letting it heal. But for him, it was this on ramp of how do we get you back to activity. So we generally use pain as your guide for that. So if it's hard for him to walk up the stairs like in his socks at home, we're not going to have him run. So we basically waited till he was pain free with just ambulatory activity, and then he had access to the Y. So the first thing we got him into was we just gave him the choice between like swimming and biking. So he got into swimming, 30 minutes twice a week. We started bumping that up to 4 times a week. We transitioned that to biking after a few weeks. And then when we got to running, our first hurdle was just, can you do sustained walking? Like our goal was to get him to 30 minutes walking pain free. He had a few times where after the walk, he would get pain in his hip for about a day and a half. That told us right there that was too much. So when you're returning an athlete to running, it needs to be boring and it needs to be pain-free. Either boring in terms of just the intensity and things like that. If we're starting to get the pain kicking up, that tells us it's too much for the tissue. We're spending too much of that money.
Yeah, I like that you brought up walking before you can run. And I think that for a lot of coaches listening to this, or maybe athletes and stuff like that, it's like you need to test out if that bone is healed with something as innocuous or seemingly innocuous as that 30-minute walk. 30 minutes of continuous walking and see, do you have any pain during? Do you have any pain afterwards within the first couple of hours? Or do you have any pain the next morning? And that's actually one of the questions that we got through social media was, how do you determine if your rehab is the right amount of painful versus too much too soon? And it seems like even though pain, we don't need to make this into a pain science discussion or anything like that. Unfortunately, pain is one of our best markers of if you're healing appropriately. And even if you have a bone stress injury that is, unhealthy enough that we need to take action about it. Because if we just took every single runner and then got MRIs of their tibias, we would see bone stress injuries and bone stress reactions, but many of these individuals be completely non-painful. And for them, they could still have a very successful season and they may never even feel any symptoms associated with what we see on the image. So the image versus the perception of pain, these are two different entities. And unfortunately, it seems like our marker for getting better is more looking at that perception of pain as our guide to increase loading. Starting out, I think, like you said, super duper boring, even with a 30-minute walk, and then seeing how it goes from there. And then you like the alternating run walk program too, right?
Yeah. So if our goal is to first here to get to the like a 30-minute walking window, if we can just start splicing it of like 3-minute cycles of 2 minutes of walking to 1 minute running, do that for 2 weeks or something like that, see how their pain is, and then easily flip it to 2 minutes of running, 1 minute of walking. And then you could, so then of those 30 minutes, you have a 20-minute run and a 10-minute walking period. So like you've more or less got 20 minutes of running. If 20 minutes of running feels all right, then you can start actually beginning to build up from there. If not, that's kind of your check-in point. It's a lot. The analogy I give with a lot of patients is like if you're getting on off on an exit that's 5 miles away, if you had to choose between getting in the exit lane, the far right lane, 20 minutes away, or wait to the last second, you choose option A just because you're basically guaranteed to get over versus trying to cut over. It doesn't hurt us to build a longer ramp to return to sport. It's easier to walk in the shallow end and keep going than drop them in the deep end.
The longer the runway, the bigger the plane, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So, so yeah, that slow on ramp is really a major key. And then what kind of accessory things should these, we're talking about runners right now. So what kind of loading strategies should runners employ to really optimize that bone health so that then someone like myself can try and prevent that recurrence?
Yeah, I mean, in addition to being smart with your running load management, just basic strength training. Two days a week is a good minimum. Good compound movements, squatting, lunges, deadlifting, like that's been shown consistently to improve running performance, running economy, things like that. You're still doing a load bearing activity. You're just not pounding the pavement, and that's we know low resistance training can be healthy for bones and help its overall resilience. Doing that in addition to your running is going to be incredibly helpful, and also just a stronger athlete's not gonna it's not gonna be a bad thing either.
Yeah, and
Additionally,
oh no, go ahead.
in terms of like preventative stuff, just kind of looking into if you're an athlete, like knowing you're going into a higher loading period. The military's play with us a little bit just because of the stress injuries in boot camp. They've actually done a few studies where they do supplement with calcium and vitamin D during, and that's been shown to reduce injuries a little bit. So like the range they did was like 200 milligrams of calcium and then like 800 to 1,000 international units of vitamin D. Like if you're at a higher risk of it and you're trying to do all the things, that's an easy, relatively cheap thing to do in addition to your overall management. Because the two things your bone needs is calcium and vitamin D. Why don't you just supplement with that? No different than, you have a strength-based athlete that's going to be pounding protein. If you, one, keep your macros right, but two, that's an easy thing you could do.
Yeah, I completely agree. And there is research showing that, if you're a female that gets in less than 800 milligrams of calcium per day, and you don't have the adequate amounts of vitamin D, which help you absorb that calcium, then you are at a much higher risk of getting a bone stress injury. This also goes along with that, disordered eating or relative energy deficiency as well. So we need to have all of our macros in check, including protein, which is really something that a lot of runners, kind of shy away from. But I mean, this sport is a sport that really tears up muscles quite a bit, and it takes a lot from our bodies. So we have to make sure that, even our running athletes are getting between 1.5 and like 2.0 grams per kilogram of body weight per day in protein every day.
Yeah, and how many coaches are having that conversation with their athletes, or just probably not, or even just the basic of like get 8 hours of sleep. Like I know that's a big goal to ask, a high school kid to try to get 8 hours, but it's worth asking.
Yeah, and it's always
The
really
other,
difficult, the sleep thing, due to like early start times in school. Maybe they have training and practice before that. And then also like the chronotype alterations that occur during adolescence that really push the time for, normal sleep onset back a couple of hours. So a lot of people blame like teenagers to saying that they're like lazy and they just don't want to go to sleep and they just want to stay up and watch TV. But there are like chronotypical alterations that push that time period when they're able to fall asleep back multiple hours. And I just got done reading Why We Sleep by Matt Walker, and he really goes into that quite a bit. So we
hmm,
recognize that getting sleep is an uphill battle, but it's a necessary battle to have. Sorry, I interrupted you there. What were you going to say?
no, I've been interrupting the whole time, man. With the just like the bringing people back, I just want to emphasize like once obviously the name of the podcast is art of prevention, but like once in terms of managing, especially if you're a provider or clinician, once somebody has this injury, it is on you to make sure it gets managed all the way through. If they crack that thing and they need surgery, get them to the ortho. But if the something's going to take, say it's going to be 16 weeks to heal, that's not, they need to be constantly monitored. Like I can think of an athlete, like the third one I diagnosed, the basically told him the diagnosis, told him to rest and get off of it. And then I saw him in the springtime, the injury was hadn't come back, but it was showing signs that it came back. And we were able to like remanage his load and things like that. But I was just thinking, like, not to be harsh, but we don't trust a 16-year-old kid to drive a car, but we're going to trust him to manage his own, manage this kind of injury on his own with a high risk of recurrence. Like this is somebody that you could easily, communicate with the parent, with the coach, with the athlete, depending on, age and their specifics of just checking in every few weeks of, hey, how was the 2 minutes on, 1 minute off going? How has that been? Like, you don't need them to be in your office necessarily. This is where like telehealth could be really easy, but just doing that gradual check-in to make sure this thing is continuing to heal and respond well, so that when you get to that endpoint, you get to just, they get to go back to training in a safe, healthy manner.
Yeah, I completely agree. And even if just having them check in via email, if you're a clinician, like you're gonna have to be the one sending the email. Like I've made the mistake of telling people to check in with me over email, and then, I'd say 90% of the time they don't. And then that last 10% is the person that you really didn't want to hear from that much. So if it's a at-risk population, an at-risk athlete that you need to monitor, like you need to send that email, you need to call the parent, you need to call the coach and check in with them, and you need to really do a good job of monitoring. And not to be like a fear monger or anything like that, but especially with these high risk things like femoral neck, I know navicular is one that we might talk about a little bit later, because that's one that there are a couple of case studies now that we're seeing, that are showing that navicular stress fractures may be associated with these super shoes and like carbon fiber plates and things like that. Um, but what's the worst thing that can happen if we don't manage these bone stress injuries appropriately?
Yeah, I mean, worst is complete fracture. So the ugliest one is the femoral neck. So this athlete I mentioned, he had the compressive. So I'm like, hey, you have the worst type of injury to get, but you have the better of the two. But he was at relatively high risk for fracture, and to not to be a jerk, but to kind of drive a point home, I asked, his parents were in the room, like, do you guys have a pair of crutches at home? And they said yes. I'm like, get when he gets home, put him on a pair of crutches. Like he's going to be non-weight bearing for 2 weeks. And that was to drive the point home, because we went through the MRI together. You could see just this huge white area where the fracture was. And they're like, so he can't run this week or he can? Like, it just doesn't, you need to use the other F word, like make it clear, like this is a type of fracture and like you are not going to be competing. Oh, kind of tying into the fear mongering, like if you work with coaches, just like let them know like the basic signs of symptoms, or like the athletic trainers. Like I think there back in the day it was again, the suck it up buttercup, but like we were fortunate enough to have a relationship with one coach. Like his audit was, he's like, look, a 15-year-old high school athlete shouldn't be limping around after practice. Like something's up. So like that was his cue to just talk to the parents, send them to the athletic trainer of, hey, something's up with Sarah or Sam or whoever, and get the process started. The other thing we kind of talked about this in pre-chat is like there's one or two things where they kind of like mimic each other. So like shin splints or medial tibial stress syndrome and like an anterior tibia stress fracture can start off looking really similar. And
Mm-hmm.
you don't want to overcall or freak the person out if it ends up being nothing. So the big delineators is, in terms of the stress fracture, it's more going to be pinpoint tenderness. I call it like the pinky test. Like they can touch it with just one spot, versus medial MTSS is more of a broad, like up to, a third or more of the anterior shin, where like they can actually, it's almost like they're going to take their whole hand and cover it. The other thing is the hop test is really useful. Just have them single leg weight bear and hop on that side. If they have point tenderness and they have the pain with the hop, it needs to be on your radar. If they have no point tenderness and no pain with hop, the sensitivity on that combination is almost 100%. Like that can allow you to be pretty confident of, hey, it's more shin splints than a BSI.
Yeah. And however, with that, when we're differentiating shin splints and bone stress injury, shin splints you can largely run through.
Yep.
But I think you mentioned earlier, and I really like this analogy, it's a check engine light. So we need to check in with sleep, we need to check in with nutrition, we need to check in with load management. And this is not the time to really like ramp things up in a crazy fashion. Or, if you see like, oh, a lot of people are hopping to prevent bone stress injuries. Now that I've got this, ache, now I should do hopping or something like that. It's like that's when we really need to be careful and kind of treat it like a yellow light where we kind of slow down a little bit and evaluate everything that's going on. We see why is this, shin splint manifestation of the medial tibial stress syndrome there, right?
Yeah, 100%. And it's always a hard conversation to shut an athlete down, especially when it's middle end of the season. It's April during track, it's October during cross country or whatever, and it's look, I just want to deal with this and run my last three races and move on. And you have to be the jerk of saying, hey, this is likely going to get worse if you continue to do this. The especially if it's the alternating track cross country, just being able to say, hey, how do you want next season to look? And getting an offer, hey, we can make this worse and add to your on ramp, or we can wrap this up now. It's going to stink. I'm so sorry. This is not how either of us wanted it to go, but we can do a lot of stuff to prevent or minimize and make sure your next season is better, and you don't have to be dealing with this.
Yeah, and you don't have to deal with a recurrence later on.
And that's where coaches, parent, athlete all have to be on board.
Oh, yeah. And so we talked about sleep is really important. We talked nutrition is really important, not only with just calcium and vitamin D, but also with just overall energy consumption. So carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, all those good things, and optimal timing throughout the day as well. And then we talked about some interventions like strength training. Now, when is an appropriate time to include strength training? Because right now it's like we're in December, but if you're a coach and you're listening to this in the middle of the season, you might think, oh, well, gosh, we need to start doing some strength training right now. But when you're already at a high baseline load or you're starting to mix volume and intensity in the middle of the season, these are time periods where it's like we need to really check ourselves as far as adding new interventions or adding new types of load. So can you tell us a little bit about resistance training and maybe even some plyometric training that everybody could do to ensure that they get adequate bone mineral density?
Yeah, no, good point. The biggest thing would just be preseason or beginning season. You do not want to be adding something brand new as their volume is increasing. So again, with a cross country example, if they're starting their training late August, early September, these would be things to just add in July, August. So plyometrics, it can be just basic hopping drills. Like our team, always took advantage of having an open field or a track of doing hopping drills or like alternating broad jumps or things like that, just to warm up that kind of impact. And then in turn, again, just a good minimum threshold is like 2 days a week of some kind of strength training. It can all be body weight of just lunges, any kind of like deadlifting. There's all kinds of creative, team workouts you can do where you're holding somebody else or lifting somebody else as part of the resistance, carrying someone on your back, things like that. I think we've all had to do that. In terms of the return, after someone sustained this injury and they're wanting to get back to it, the criteria, this is just my opinion, the criteria I've tried to use is if they can run for 30 minutes comfortably, that would be a safe time for them to do strength training. Again, if each step walking around at home, in their flip-flops is uncomfortable, you don't want to load that. So time it with they're in the relatively comfortable phase and you're starting to build up more. You could even choose to increase their strength training because you're still pushing the bone and the limits of the bones as it's healed before you go into increased volume or mileage with the running.
Yeah. And what are your thoughts on? I know there was a bit of a discrepancy in the literature in like the 2000s, 2010s, et cetera. The big hype was on ground reaction forces. But we know that we only have a limited data from things like force plates and ground reaction forces because actually a lot of the load, the tensile loading that really affects the bone actually comes from the musculature itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we need to train not only looking at ground reaction force, the amount of force that's just hitting into the ground with each foot strike, but we also need to do things that are going to challenge the intrinsic muscle force as well, correct?
Yeah, exactly. Like, and we can. There's a thousand things with just the value of just a variety of training. You're not doing silly stuff. You're not making hop on a Bosu ball with chewing bubble gum, but like there's a lot of value in doing single leg training or just some basic balance drills and things like that. And this can go into different topic, different time of like what are the other injuries you're trying to like prevent? Like the stress fracture is an ugly one, but like what are other common tendinitises, tendinopathies, things like that with runners? A lot of it just comes down to like load management.
Hmm. And strength training and resistance training will benefit those athletes across domains of their physiology. So, I mean, if we want really like a cure-all or a magical pill that's going to, one, improve running economy, and then also increase bone mineralization, increase cross-sectional area of muscle, as well as tendon and ligament, strength training and resistance training covers all of these. And then if we look at the athlete, not only as that 4-year high school runner, but if we look at them as a human being with an entire lifespan, we know that peak bone mineralization occurs in, the teens and 20s, or not peak bone mineralization, but our peak ability to deposit mineralization in bone, our peak ability to really densify those bones for the entire lifespan occurs from basically adolescence and then into the early 20s. So if you're a running coach, like it's easy to think about this individual as a runner that's going to, be in your hands from freshman year to senior year, and then they're off onto college or whatever. But really, I would encourage coaches to think of these as human beings that we're trying to create health and a good health span throughout their entire lives. And a lot of that has to do with bone health.
Yeah, and the I love the way you're bringing that up because on the flip side, nobody is walking around hoping they break their hip in their 70s, but all these things that you do in the early stage of your life, just any kind of physical, like how many Americans aren't hitting the minimal physical activity guidelines? Like the things you do in your younger years, whether you're an athlete, recreational athlete, whatever, set you up whether you like it or not for the rest of your life. So you doing stuff to increase your muscle mass, your ability to increase your bone density, you are putting the example I always say with patients is you are putting money in the bone bank that you're going to be able to spend later. You having I think we've all seen like the MRI of the average 80-year-old guy and then some 80-year-old triathlete. Like you just see it as a huge difference in that cross section of tissue. Who's the person who's going to have a higher quality of life, who's going to be able to play around with their grandkids, who's going to be able to live unassisted, unaided for a longer period of time, and just all quality effect, just being able to. So yeah, I appreciate what you're saying about like, thinking about these athletes as just human beings. Like we need to think about people in the near term get worse. Like what you do now is going to affect the later stage of your life. Nobody looks forward to breaking a hip or being risk of a hip fracture. If you break a hip, the odds of you being dead in 2 years is significant. So if you can minimize that now and just the quality of life, being able to be an active older adult is huge. In terms of one, care for yourself, bath environment valuable, and a few patients that older. I have a few older female patients in their 70s, and they're runners. They go to the gym frequently, and when I'm seeing them, the aches and pains they're talking about is being sore from a 12-mile run with their granddog. Versus I have other patients who are even in their 50s talking about walking through the grocery store and having peripheral neuropathy, claudication, having problems just like getting out of the waiting chair and coming to the office. And you're thinking, the next for these two, the two different people I mentioned, the trajectory over the next, 5 to 20 years is drastically different in terms of quality of life, their healthcare costs. This is really off track and it's not related directly to the BSI, but just overall, just hitting physical activity guidelines and being able to have that conversation with your patients is huge.
Yeah, I completely agree. And one thing that I saw in a recent like article that was published about bone stress injury was I think it was Warden et al. Talking about how running is not osteogenic, you know? Running is a lot of the
Mm.
same load in a unidirectional fashion. So it's a lot of the exact same load over and over and over again. And after about 10 to 20 minutes, we stop stimulating bone cells to turn over and we basically cease stimulus for those bone cells to adapt. However, we are still exposing that bone to micro strain and micro damage. So if you're doing, a 20-mile run, the first 2 or 3 miles is when you're really stimulating those osteoblastic cells and all of your bone cells to turn over and adapt. The remainder of that run, you're causing strain and micro damage, but you're not necessarily still getting that same amount of stimulus. And that's why strength training is so important because strength training and even short amounts of hopping, like 30 to 60 repetitions of hopping, can be really beneficial and can create a lot of stimulus for bone to adapt, uh, even more so than running.
Yeah, or even with the unidirectional stuff, like a multi-sport athlete is we're seeing more and more benefits of that. Like having forget hopping, if you have a kid that does track and does basketball, like they're going to be moving in a multi-directional fashion a lot more with basketball than with running, and that is going to be that's going to stimulate the bone in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I completely agree. So we've got to think about other ways in which we can stimulate bone, whether it be strength training, plyometrics, and even other sports, which is going to really help out with that athlete's overall well-being from a, mental standpoint as well as a physiological standpoint too. All right. So Tyler, I always like to finish off these episodes talking about Benjamin Franklin and the Philadelphia Fire Department. So you're from Philadelphia, right? So you're probably
I'm
pretty.
from just outside of Philly, yeah.
Yeah. So when he started the Philadelphia Volunteer Fire Department, he has this famous quote, "An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure." So unfortunately, with bone stress injury, the cure is really rest and then reload at a later time. But what is your ounce of prevention? If we could sum up this entire, about an hour long conversation and give somebody a little tidbit, a little golden nugget, if you will, about preventing bone stress injuries, what would you say?
Yeah, it would be three things. One, manage the initial load. Be smart with it. Don't slow and steady wins the race. Like huge changes are not going to be beneficial for the runner, for the athlete, things like that. So just watch your load. Two, variety of activity, in terms of running itself, but intersplicing it with other things, whether that be other sports, plyometrics, strength training, things like that. And then just finally managing your nutrition well, like that nutrition and sleep, really just making sure your body has a chance to recover. Those are the pieces that'll set you up for success, and that will help you reduce your odds, or dare I say, even prevent.
Nutrition, sleep, and load management. I love it. Well, Tyler, thank you so much for giving us a lot of your experience and a lot of your insights today. And I look forward to talking to you again in the future.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.